What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. Hope y'all are ready to discuss some superheroes and people beating the crap out of each other because it's time to review Deadpool and Wolverine. And I'm just going to break up my video into the following categories: my non-spoiler section, my spoiler section, and don't worry, I'll leave a time code below as well as giving you a verbal warning. And then I'll wrap things up with some recommendations, predictions, etc., and so forth. But let's start with the easy part. This is 2 hours and 7 minutes of light entertainment that more or less whizzes by. Is it all good? No. Is it all bad? No. But there are some great scenes. Like I wouldn't say I was laughing or thrilled throughout the entirety of the movie, but there were 2 or 3 scenes where I kind of sat back with a big smile on my face, very content, very pleased, thoroughly enjoying it. But it was weird, like half my theater was empty. And I went to a really cool theater at the Village East by Angelica. And there was one person in there who clearly has never seen a Marvel show or a Marvel movie that they do not like, because every single line, every single action beat, they were laughing uproariously. But I was kind of studying the audience from time to time. They weren't necessarily laughing any more than I was, which I thought was a little alarming for the future prospects of the movie. But it is very watchable, very enjoyable. It's got tons of cameos, and what's fun about the cameos is like they have cameos from all the Fox films as well as one from New Line Cinema, or 3 from New Line Cinema. And then you've got these weird cameos or Easter eggs that come from the comics. And it's almost like they recognize, well, we have the people who've been watching these movies for the last 25 years and know that history really well. And then we've got like the true, diehard superhero nerds, the ones that have been clamoring for things like Wolverine's suit and mask, etc., and so forth. And one thing this movie does really well that a lot of us other superhero movies or just franchises fail to do, clearly they are listening to the fans, at least to some degree. They're like, look, for a quarter century, people have been asking to see Wolverine and Sabretooth face off. Or for a quarter of a century, people have been asking to see Hugh Jackman in the suit. Can't we just throw them a goddamn bone? And who knows, like it might actually work. And the good news is, probably the best ingredient in the movie is Wolverine's costume, but I'm getting ahead of myself. What you have here basically is your classic buddy formula, and there have been a million movies that take advantage of that formula. I mean, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid would be one example where they spend a lot of time bickering, but also they're buddies. Freebie and the Bean from the 70s might be the more appropriate comparison, just because they spend so much of that movie bickering. They're not stabbing each other, but they do a lot of bickering in that movie. And if you like 70s car movies, definitely check out Freebie and the Bean. But it is delightful watching Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman just, it's like this dysfunctional married couple in a lot of ways, where one's very weird and always jabbering like an idiot. The other's very sullen and very surly and very drunk. And periodically they bond, and periodically they stab the shit out of each other. And it only wears thin from time to time, because I think Ryan Reynolds' shtick as Deadpool has started to wear thin. And he's fallen into this routine over the last couple of years where no matter what movie he's appearing in, he acts and talks like Deadpool the whole time. So it makes the Deadpool movies feel a little less special. I feel like he should almost willfully and deliberately try to not act like Deadpool in his other films, just to keep the character of Deadpool feeling fresh, and so on and so forth. But, it's been, 6 years since the last Deadpool movie, so I was thrilled to see him back in action. It's cool as shit watching him, like John Woo style, blowing people away or skewering people with those katanas of his. And of course, with Hugh Jackman, I mean, we're talking about a guy now who has played the character of Logan, aka Wolverine, 10 times, going back to X-Men, which came out in 2000, and X-Men, X2, X3, X-Men Origins Wolverine, X-Men First Class, The Wolverine, X-Men Days of Future Past, X-Men Apocalypse, Logan, Deadpool, and Wolverine. What's a miracle out of all those movies is how Hugh Jackman's batting average is actually better than a lot of other movie stars. Like, usually if you have a franchise, like a long-running franchise, 90% of that franchise is going to fucking suck. Like, look at Marvel over the last 5 years. The great majority of Marvel over the last 5 years has fucking sucked. But Hugh Jackman, he's managed to ride this wave through, like, the ebb and flow and rise and fall and rise again. But, like, every trend in the superhero genre over the last quarter century, he's been right there at the core of it, and he's remained one of the most exciting, interesting, entertaining parts of it, and he holds nothing back in this. Like, is it as good as Logan? Like, no, it doesn't have the dramatic gravitas of Logan, but there are 1 or 2 scenes where Hugh Jackman actually is allowed to act and deliver some real drama, and holy shit, he has still got it. But speaking of batting averages, I looked up a list of the MCU and every single show or movie that's come out over the last 5 years since Endgame. And I'm including movies by Sony. But the batting average isn't good. Like, here's a list of all the movies that I would say that Wolverine or Deadpool and Wolverine is superior to. So that Hall of Shame includes Black Widow, Shang-Chi, Venom, Let There Be Carnage, Loki, Eternals, Morbius, Moon Knight, Miss Marvel, Thor Love and Thunder, She-Hulk, Quantumania or Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, Secret Invasion, The Marvels, Echo, Madam Web. Pretty much the only piece of Marvel content in the last 5 years that I would say is better than Deadpool and Wolverine would be Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And I think with the Spider-Man No Way Home, is that the third one? Yeah. God damn. Yeah, there's Far From Home, Homecoming, Far From Home, and then No Way Home. It's probably about on the level of No Way Home in terms of callbacks, Easter eggs, cameos, etc. and so forth. But if you're a massive fan of Spidey, well, then you're probably going to like No Way Home more. And if you're a massive fan of Wolverine and Deadpool, you're probably going to like Deadpool and Wolverine more. So at a minimum, Deadpool and Wolverine is a step in the right direction because they basically take all the storylines and all the characters that have basically been part of Fox and or New Line Cinema over the last 25 years. They stir them all together. And for the most part, it's like I said before, a lightly entertaining ride. There's a lot of gore, but it's all like, CGI gore. It has really no impact on the audience whatsoever. And there are a lot of jokes. Some of them work. There's a big thing throughout the whole movie. Every single scene, Deadpool is constantly talking about wanting to get fucked up the ass or sucking cock or whatever the case might be. And it's like, all right, we get it. You're broad-minded sexually, but it's like every single scene involves like somebody like, grabbing his hog or his honker or whatever word you want to use. And it's like, all right, can we move on? We totally get at this point. You've made your point abundantly clear 100 times over, and I guess your mileage will vary on the degree to which you find those jokes funny, but it gets a little, like any part of Deadpool's shtick, it gets tired after a while. However, what this movie wisely did, which Deadpool 2 did not, they allowed him a few moments where he got serious. And I feel like Deadpool, if you look at the first movie, which I think is better than all the other Deadpool movies, but if you look at the first movie, there are brief shining moments where he actually does take things seriously. And it makes his jokes and his kind of like his hero's journey all the more impactful when you have a little variety. And very wisely, this movie gives us one or two scenes where he tries to actually get serious for a second, which leads to a scene which I'll discuss in the spoiler section, because it was my favorite scene in the movie, but it wouldn't have been as good if you didn't have Deadpool legitimately getting his feelings hurt for a second, where you're like, oh my God, maybe Wolverine should not have said that to him. But while I'm on the subject of things that I liked, I should give a shout out to Emma Corrin, my twin sister, who plays Cassandra Nova, and I have to say, she kind of knocked it out of the park. And when I first read the original stories featuring Cassandra Nova, written by Grant Morrison and drawn by Frank Quitely back in the days of New X-Men back in 2001, never in a million years would I have dreamed that I would be saying this in 2024, but Cassandra Nova is kind of hot. I don't know if it's just the hairdo, but she was doing it for me. And for a movie that's just nothing but butt sex jokes, wall to wall for 2 straight hours, she actually offered a nice alternative to that. And I was like, all right, well then here's something for me that I can sink my teeth into. And I have to say, yeah, she played a damn good villain. And if you don't have a great villain in these movies, it's like, what's the point? That's one of the areas where Marvel has consistently failed. Apart from a few exceptions, I would say historically, going back to 2008, Marvel has consistently and regularly given us terrible villains, but Emma Corrin wasn't bad as Cassandra Nova at all. And while I never planned on watching Lady Shatterley's Lover, but now that I know that she's in it and that there's generous sex scattered throughout it, I might have to revisit the subject of watching Lady Shatterley's Lover. But what else can we say about the good before I get into the dark side of this review? I guess the big question is this movie good enough to reverse the negative trend that we've seen recently for the MCU, where the shows get watched less often, the movies are making less money? Disney is obviously aware of the fact that from 2008 to 2019, it was onwards and upwards, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Then they let a lot of their best filmmakers and writers, move on to greener pastures, and it's been an absolute train wreck ever since. And how can I say this? Because this movie's using things that were built up in other movies, it's not really laying the groundwork for future Marvel movies, unless you have a situation where Deadpool and Wolverine team back up for Avengers: Secret Wars. And if you've never read, where's my Secret Wars? Anyways, there's the Secret Wars. somewhere around here. There's a Secret Wars from the early 80s, which I loved, and there's a Secret Wars from about 10 years ago written by Jonathan Hickman, both of which could be tapped into to make a really cool Avengers Secret Wars movie. But I feel like getting Deadpool and Wolverine in on the action would be a very wise course of action. But I'm not seeing any evidence yet that Marvel can reverse the negative trend, because Sean Levy, and maybe this is the best time to transition into the negative, and once again, totally spoiler free, but the MCU is going to need to rediscover their love of dynamic, like interesting, stylistically distinctive directors. And whether you love these directors or hate these directors, you can't argue against the idea that like they all have their own individual style. Like Jon Favreau, Joss Whedon, the Russo brothers, James Gunn, Sam Raimi, Taika Waititi, like all these filmmakers, they all have a style, and some people find their style obnoxious. Some people find their style to be like, nectar of the gods. But like they feel like James Gunn movies, or they feel like Russo brothers movies, or they feel like Joss Whedon movies. Marvel over the last 5 years has had a really bad problem of movies that were like the absence of style. And I think director Sean Levy falls right into that category, where he's one of those directors where it seems like once you turn the camera on and more or less point it at the action, like he feels like his work as a director is finished. Like the lighting is flat, the camera angles are uninteresting. Like he doesn't do anything with the visual art of storytelling that couldn't be done by AI or just like the most basic storyboarding humanly possible. It's almost like his style of directing is to remove everything from directing that makes directing movies interesting. And I have no idea why he is the director of this movie, apart from the fact that he's friends with Ryan Reynolds, and he's directed a lot of bland, generic hit movies in the past, like all those fucking Night at the Museum movies. Like that is who Sean Levy is. But if Marvel wants to reclaim the heights that they once had with Infinity War and Endgame, they didn't get there by accident. It's because they had the same writers and the same directors do Winter Soldier, then Civil War, then Infinity War, and then Endgame. So even though there are a bunch of other Marvel movies all around it, you had this one dynamic creative team of 4 storytellers kind of giving like the spine to the MCU, and they're going to need to find some way to like rebuild the spine of the MCU. And maybe the best way to rebuild that spine is with a bunch of kick-ass Fantastic Four and X-Men movies and the occasional Avengers movie. Like, give them a lot of new characters to play with, because the reality is over the last 5 years, Marvel's introduced a lot of characters. They're not that popular. Is anybody screaming for a movie starring Echo or Madam Web or any of those characters? Like, there have been a lot of poor choices made over the last 5 years, and I think it'll take as many years of good movies to kind of undo the damage of all those years of terrible movies and terrible shows before you could really say the trend line is moving in a new direction. But what else can we say about this movie which I did not like? The fucking Time Variance Authority, or the TVA. I feel like my advice to Marvel right now would be, look at every single screenplay that's in development for film or television and take out a black Sharpie and just cross out every time the TVA comes up, any of those characters come up, or anything related to timelines or the multiverse. Just cross it all out. There are even, well, actually, I guess it's, fuck it. We're going into spoiler light territory, because even the movie Deadpool and Wolverine makes fun of the multiverse. Like, look, you've tried it for a couple of years. It's not resonating. It's not working. This multiverse bullshit, all it does is remove any sense of stakes in the story, because anytime someone dies, like Wolverine, you can just go find another one. Or anytime something happens, like the world gets destroyed, well, you can just go to a different timeline and start over again. Like, there's no danger of anything ever being permanent or lasting, or like any like permanent changes to the status quo, because the TVA can always just change everything at the click of a button. It's so fucking boring. And unfortunately with this movie, for like the first 45 minutes of the movie, it's nothing but TVA bullshit. And I love Tom from Succession. I know he's got a real name like Matthew McFadden or something like that, but he will be Tom until his dying day, because he was fucking brilliant as Tom in Succession. He's very well cast in this movie, but he's still a part of the fucking TVA, and I think the TVA is pure fucking garbage. Every single show or movie that includes the TVA, there should just be like this, a new cut where you just remove it entirely. And I'm sorry, that means Loki goes bye-bye as well. I know some people really like Loki. I thought fucking Loki sucked as well because of the goddamn TVA. And even though this movie does have a few really good scenes that I really enjoyed, there's no getting around the fact that most of the movie feels kind of rushed and sloppily thrown together. Like, there's some really good actors in here making some really cool cameos that could have been even cooler than just having them show up. But they just feel like they're sleepwalking through their lines, like lines that might have been written like 5 minutes before they showed up. Like, slow down, take the time to actually write something cool. And I know, obviously Ryan Reynolds I think he even sacrificed a huge part of his own salary in order to make sure he had his writers close by at all times. So clearly he values their contributions. But once again, I just feel like Sean Levy, he's a non-entity as a filmmaker. If he's got a fight scene going on, there's a 50-50 chance that the choreography is going to feel sloppy. Or if he has a dramatic scene, there's a 50-50 chance it's going to feel limp. He doesn't seem to care about any of the scenes. It's just like, what do we need to do to get in the can and move on? I imagine he's really good at sticking to schedules. I imagine he's really good at staying on budget. But what he's not good at is giving us the kind of moments that someone like Joss Whedon or the Russo brothers or even friggin' Jon Favreau were able to give us in a lot of their better Marvel movies. And one final nitpicky grievance, there's a very prominent scene in this movie featuring a very well-known song by NSYNC, and I'm sorry, in the late 90s they sucked, and in 2024 they suck even more. And using one of their most iconic songs for an incredibly important scene makes your movie worse, not better. And my little sisters would probably cut my throat and take me out back and like remove my organs and like spit on me and piss on me, and they would laugh at my funeral for saying something like that. NSYNC sucks. They used to go to their concerts, blah blah blah. But I stand by my original assertion. If you put NSYNC's music in your movie, well then your movie just drops a few notches. And if you disagree with me, well then come find me in New York. I will say the exact same thing right to your face. But one last negative. I've been seeing a lot of people predicting that this movie is going to open somewhere between like 150 and 160 million. And I was listening to the podcast The Town the other day, and Matthew Bellany is really good at making predictions. He was predicting that this movie would open at over 165 million. And I just don't know. Like maybe my theater was just full of like, or maybe my theater's usually like visited by a different form of moviegoer clientele. But a half-empty theater on opening day, I've never seen that before with a Marvel movie. Even terrible Marvel movies tend to sell out. And also a half-empty theater with only one guy laughing. I'm actually going to take the under on 165 million, and I might live to regret these words on Sunday when I do my box office breakdown. But I'm going to say it's going to open right where people originally said, like somewhere between like 150 and 160, which is still fantastic. But Marvel, when it's really firing on all cylinders, can open like at levels that are just absolutely unheard of. I still think there's a chance this movie might make it to $1 billion worldwide, just because like the global audience for Marvel is still huge, but it might limp across the finish line like a month from now. But luckily, it's got more or less like a wide open playing field for the next couple of weeks. So the box office is there for Deadpool and Wolverine to snatch up. So there it is. That is the end of my spoiler-free section. It is better than the great majority of all the bullshit that's been put out by Marvel over the last 5 years. And it will not upset the average that has been established by Hugh Jackman over the last 24 years. He's been in 10 movies with the character Wolverine, and I'd say that the good ones are X-Men, X2, First Class. He was barely in it, but that was one of the good ones. X-Men Days of Future Past, Logan, and Deadpool and Wolverine. I'll include it in the mix, but X3, X-Men Origins Wolverine, The Wolverine, even though it has some good scenes, and then X-Men Apocalypse, all those can be kind of like shoved aside. So once again, I guess he's batting 600, which is not bad for an aging movie star. But let's get into a few spoilers before wrapping this sucker up. But now we're officially in the spoiler section, so last warning, 3, 2, 1. But let's get into the nitty-gritty, very nerdy details, and let's start with my favorite scene of the movie, or my favorite moment of the movie, where Deadpool and Wolverine, like we're getting close to the climax, they're about to go into this huge battle, and Hugh Jackman very casually pulls his mask over, and it looked fucking awesome. Like, way better than I would have expected. I was like, wait a second, like, Spider-Man's mask has looked pretty cool over the years. Some Batman movies have gotten it right. Deadpool's mask actually looks pretty fucking awesome. But it's like, fans have been clamoring for and screaming for this goddamn mask and costume for a quarter century, and it's like, it's so abundantly obvious and so clear that it works on film and that it looks great. It's like, didn't y'all try like any screen tests or anything like that? Like you could have figured this out back in 2000 and made a lot of fans really, really happy. But at a minimum, here we are, 2024, and the costume just looks fucking epic. It looks pretty cool throughout, but he doesn't put the mask on until the very end, and then once it's on, it stays on, and it just looked outstanding. And then it helps that they go into this really cool action scene, which looked like something right out of like Old Boy, where the camera, it's like one of the only scenes where Sean Levy actually tries to do something interesting with the camera, where it's just panning from left to right as the two of them just mow through basically like 200 different variations of Deadpool from different universes. And you know, it's got blood going everywhere, but it's all digital blood. Like none of it really None of it matters, but at least it was a good action scene. And at the very end, the two of them come blasting out at the end of this bus, like in these like classic kind of like early '90s superhero poses. And obviously, Wolverine was invented. When did he first appear in Hulk? Like early '70s, like '72 or '73. I started reading comics in '79, and so I was there for like all Chris Claremont's great heyday. But obviously, Deadpool didn't come around until the early '90s in the pages of New Mutants. But in the early 90s, when Wolverine and Deadpool were both insanely popular, they were known for like these, great dramatic poses on like big splash pages or on the covers. And when they come out of the bus together, it looked like one of those early 90s covers. I was thrilled. And it got me thinking about a lot of different franchises these days where it almost feels like the writers and directors are permanently at war with the fans of the franchise or people who've been loving it for a long time, whether that's, The Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or whatever. But sometimes giving the fans what they want actually will work out. Like I don't think you should sit around like taking requests and then writing screenplays, but there are things that fans want to see in their favorite franchises, and if they see those things, then they go from your worst enemies to basically being foot soldiers, going out and basically like spreading the good word on your behalf. And there are a couple of other scenes along those lines, like Hulk versus Wolverine. I mean, the way we first got introduced to Wolverine 100,000 years ago was with him fighting Hulk. But when I was a kid, we had a situation where with the art of Todd McFarlane, Hulk and Wolverine threw down, and it was just fucking epic. It was so goddamn good, and that comic became an instant bestseller, an all-time classic, etc., and so forth. And they would meet up periodically. Like one time, they even met up when Wolverine was in his patch persona, and they do show us the patch persona here. Basically, when he's working as like a gambler for a long time, he had yet another kind of alter ego where he wasn't like wearing the brown and yellow or brown and orange, and he wasn't wearing the blue and yellow. He wasn't wearing any of that stuff. He was just patch. But for diehard comic book fans, they will appreciate that. There was even one big epic shot, which was just an homage to this classic cover from Uncanny X-Men 251. But from that period, this is one of the most iconic images of Wolverine. And probably the most bizarre bit of fan service in here, which I welcome, but it will be a little obscure for most people. But basically, at one point, Deadpool is traveling through different timelines, trying to find a Wolverine who will help him on his mission. And he keeps bumping into all these different versions of Wolverine along the way. And one of those versions is the version of Wolverine from Age of Apocalypse. And the way you can tell it's the Age of Apocalypse, he has a blue and red costume, but he's also missing one of his hands. I was like, Jesus Christ, all right. Y'all have been digging through the back bins to find like every variation of Wolverine that you possibly can, including one by Henry Cavill, and I have to say, it kind of worked. But another scene that I mentioned earlier, which I couldn't go into without going into spoilers, but my other favorite scene of this movie, at one point, Wolverine and Deadpool are in this car, and they just, Wolverine's had enough. And he just lets Deadpool know exactly what he thinks about him and his whole manner of speaking, his code of conduct, his behavior, his ethics, his sense of honor, like all the above. And Wolverine just dresses him down and just talks so much shit. And Hugh Jackman, just like every bit of ferocity that he's got in his body as an actor, he's just laying it out there because Deadpool's wearing a mask. Can't quite tell how he's receiving it. And at the end, you can just tell he's so wounded and his feelings are so hurt. And he says, we're going to fight now. And the way he says it, like his feelings have been shattered. And any hesitance that he might have shown earlier in the movie, the first time they fight, it's all well and good, and they're stabbing each other and shooting each other and all that good stuff. But it's in the second fight where it's like, all right, this is the Deadpool and Wolverine fight that we've been waiting for, because they fight inside of a car, so there's nowhere to go. So it's just nothing but like, it's just point blank rage and evisceration, and they just go to fucking war, and it's hilarious. Like it goes from like hard drama to absolute hysteria very, very quickly, and it was just by far one of the best scenes of the movie. But alas, we come to the Fox cameos, and I know a lot of people have been discussing the Fox cameos. Who's going to make the cut? Who's not going to make the cut? I was really hoping for at least one big reunion between Cyclops and Storm and Beast and Jean and Wolverine and Professor X. I would have loved to have seen something resembling like a classic lineup of X-Men from the movies. We didn't get that. But we did get Chris Evans as Human Torch, and I could tell that some people who had not heard that Human Torch was going to be in this, when Chris Evans showed up, they're like, "Oh my God, it's Captain America!" and they all just lost their minds. But I have to say, Chris Evans, either they shot these scenes really quickly, or they didn't give him a script in advance, where they were just kind of feeding him lines before he said it. He turns in a pretty wretched performance, but we do finally get to see what would happen if Human Torch and Pyro ever threw down. And this is kind of nerdy shit the comic book fans used to talk about back in the 80s and 90s. Like, what would happen if this person fought this person when you have like powers that are kind of related? Pyro can control flame, Human Torch creates it. So we get to see that outcome, and it was cool seeing him, as human. Like, the Fantastic Four movies back then were total garbage, but Chris Evans was fine. And Jennifer Garner was kind of garbage as Elektra back in Daredevil. I never actually saw the Elektra spinoff, but when she showed up, I welcomed her return. I mean, when Daredevil first came out, like, we were just getting that first big like wave of superhero movies. So anyway, Daredevil, it's got its moments, but it's a pretty wretched movie. But I was thrilled and delighted to see Blade make an appearance, because obviously over the last 5 years, Marvel keeps saying, "Oh, we're making a Blade movie, but we just can't figure out the script." I'm like, it's not that hard. You have Blade show up in like in a nightclub with blood coming out of the ceiling, and he kills a bunch of vampires. And then he goes on, then he fights the main bad guy, and the movie's over. Like, those screenplays more or less can write themselves. Like, clearly, whatever Marvel's trying to do with Blade is just one of many things that has been going wrong over at that troubled studio. But it does seem like they are trying to turn things around and change direction. So I remain open to the possibility that Marvel might figure it out. But there's a great line by Wesley Snipes in this movie. He's like I'm the Blade, like the one and only, and there'll never be another Blade. And, Deadpool kind of looks at the screen, yada, yada, yada. But it was cool seeing him back in action. It's Wesley Snipes is a bad motherfucker. I grew up watching his movies. I love seeing him as Blade. But Channing Tatum's kind of horrible as Gambit, and I hate to say that, but he seems a little out of shape, and the accent's a little off, and they even call attention to that in the movie. But, I love Gambit from back like in the early 90s when he first made his appearance. Like, drawn by Jim Lee, Gambit is cool as fucking shit. And I don't think Gambit should have ever had his own solo spin-off movie, because I feel like if you're going to have Gambit in a story, it should be Gambit interacting with Rogue at a minimum. And, like, you need some other X-Men around them. But in the end, Gambit's love affair with Rogue is kind of like part of the big heart and soul of the character. Like, can you be in love with someone that you can never touch? It's a great, romantic scenario. For someone who's clearly like a womanizer and very experienced, can he live with somebody or be in love with somebody that he'll never actually be able to, like, make physical contact with? But I guess I wanted to always say back in the early 90s, you can always just wear a condom, dude, and you'll be totally fine. But anyway, that's not the way Marvel Comics were thinking back in the early 90s. But one of my favorite Fox cameos by far was seeing X-23 again. And she does have one really good dramatic scene where she's sitting by the fire and basically giving Logan a little tough love. And, he's kind of feeling sorry for himself. Like, oh, I'm not a hero. I'm a bad guy. I'm a bad person. Ah, la, la, la. And she's like, well, you've always been kind of a bad person. You were never the right guy for the job, but that's not why you were great, et cetera and so forth. But anyway, it was great to see her in action again. But perhaps she was underutilized. But obviously, this is Deadpool and Wolverine, not Logan Part 2. But her fans, I think, they'll be more or less happy. They won't necessarily be thrilled, but they'll be happy to see her again. But some other characters that made an appearance, at least one that they really fucked up. There's never been a movie that's gotten the Juggernaut correct. First and foremost, they're always trying to pretend as if he's a mutant. No, he's not a mutant at all. He got his powers through magic, through the crimson bands of Cyttorak or Kaitorak or whatever. And he and Charles Xavier were fighting in the Korean War. They found this cave. He put on the bands. He got all these powers. And it took him decades to dig his way out. But in the comics, Juggernaut can take on Thor. Juggernaut can take on Hulk. Juggernaut can take on anybody, and he's completely impervious to harm in any way, shape, or form. Nothing stops the Juggernaut. And the only way you can ever defeat him is by getting that helmet off his head and letting Professor X get inside his brain and knocking him out. But in this movie, at one point, X-23 just comes up behind him and just hacks his Achilles tendons open. Like, I'm sorry, her claws would snap in two on Juggernaut. Nothing stops the Juggernaut, including adamantium claws. So they screwed him up in X3, they screwed him up in Deadpool 2, they screwed him up here, and if you want a great story featuring the Juggernaut, there was one, I think it was the first issue ever drawn by Mark Silvestri, where Longshot, Psylocke, Rogue, and Dazzler, not exactly like a lineup of heavy hitters, but the four of them have to stop the Juggernaut. And luckily with Psylocke, they can get inside his brain, but they do have to get his helmet off so Psylocke can take him out. That was a really cool issue featuring the Juggernaut back in the day. But if you're a fan of all the movies that were made over at Fox, basically from 2000 up through whenever Disney finally acquired Fox, they have this great little montage reel at the end where they're showing a behind-the-scenes look at a lot of those movies while they're in production. Like, you're seeing Hugh Jackman, a quarter century ago, like, oh my God, like, I really hope I'll do a good job as Wolverine and blah, blah, blah. And it really was an interesting just like time capsule or sentimental journey. Like, when you realize like how much of our lives that we've devoted to watching these movies, discussing these movies, debating these movies. Like, when these movies first started coming out, I basically had 25 years of comic book knowledge that I was comparing and contrasting the movies with. But now we've got 25 years of movie knowledge that we're comparing and contrasting with. It's crazy just how much of our pop culture has been dominated by all these characters. And I totally embrace it because I spent a huge chunk of my life reading these stories. But it's all execution based, and you can't just phone the shit in. And if these movies aren't made with love and care and attention to detail by really good filmmakers, well then, the fans will slowly drift away. Like, nobody likes these stories. Like, there have been times in the history of Marvel Comics or many times, where certain titles, even if you love the characters, if you have some jackass writing it, some jackass drawing it, well then the comic starts to suck and you stop buying it. Same holds true with these movies. If you've got jackasses making them, well then the whole MCU phenomenon just will fizzle into nothing. But it looks like Disney, they're not going to give this up without a fight. And they're going to try. I mean, the fact that the Russo brothers are coming back for 2 more Avengers movies, I feel like it's like one of these like dick measuring contests where Kevin Feige and the Russos probably both felt as if they deserved the credit for the success of the MCU, but neither one of them has been able to replicate that success without each other. And so inevitably, Feige and the Russos were going to have a reunion. In any event, before I wrap up this video, I do want to make a few comic book recommendations. And when it comes to the character of Wolverine, you basically... Like, the essential storyline is the entire storyline written by Chris Claremont from the late 70s up through the early 90s, where either through like Wolverine limited series and or just the pages of Uncanny X-Men, Chris Claremont guided that character, because when Chris Claremont first came on board the X-Men, Wolverine was a little bit more one-dimensional, but it's slowly but surely Claremont kind of like discovered like there's like a tormented soul, or like, like a fallen samurai beneath this tough guy exterior, and he really helped flesh him out. And the best storyline for that is the one drawn by Frank Miller. When I was 6 years old, this came out as a limited series just called Wolverine number 1, 2, 3, and 4. I loved it when I was 6, and I love it now. You cannot beat that. But basically, like, you need the entire Chris Claremont run. So, like, whether you like it or not, you have to just read, 15 years worth of X-Men comics and New Mutant comics to get the entire storyline. But in that, it's just so many legendary stories. But one of my favorites was this issue 173, which came out in 1983, drawn by Paul Smith, where Wolverine goes back to Japan, where he and Rogue basically have like the world's coolest team up, where they go out and just wreak havoc, and Wolverine has a great battle with the Silver Samurai. But back in the day, before comics tried to like overtly become cinematic, artists like Paul Smith knew how to make like it feel cinematic by doing these big wide panels. Anyway, that was cool as fucking shit. But if you want to know why it was such a big deal to have Wolverine and Sabretooth face off in this movie, it's one of those things where fans have just been asking for. And sometimes fans are asking for something because it comes from a place that's cool. And there was a storyline called The Mutant Massacre written by Chris Claremont. But by the end of it, they swapped out the artist for Alan Davis, who would be kind of an on-again, off-again X-Men artist for a while, alongside like Arthur Adams and Mark Silvestri, and then like Jim Lee. But anyway, the X-Men had a lot of great artists back in the day. But the end of the Mutant Massacre storyline was X-Men 213 back in 1987, where it wasn't even much of a fight between Wolverine and Sabretooth, but basically while they're fighting, Psylocke, who's about to join the team for the first time, before she's even like reincarnated as a ninja, she was just like like an English aristocrat in a lot of ways, but she's reading Sabretooth's brain to try to figure out like who the Marauders are, who are they working for, blah, blah, blah. But I guess the first issue in the Mutant Massacre storyline, was it 210 or 211? But anyway, if you want to see one of the darkest X-Men storylines, the Mutant Massacre storyline is tough to beat. But if, like me, you found yourself getting aroused by Cassandra Nova during this movie, I'm also going to recommend people hunt down New X-Men 114 through 117 from Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely, which came out back in 2001. You will not be attracted to her in that story, but if you like great villains, great art, just really cool X-Men storylines where they basically like boil the team down just to the essentials, that was a really good time to be an X-Men fan. Like after the Claremont era was over, there was like a 10-year period where X-Men were like really, really popular, but you didn't have as many like great writers or great artists like lending their hand to the X-Men storylines. But when Grant Morrison got on the book, you really felt like they were back on firm footing, which leads to like Joss Whedon doing Astonishing X-Men, and a bunch of other writers came on afterwards, or even Jonathan Hickman in recent years. But Grant Morrison kind of like reversed the trend at that time. And anyway, very cool comic, which I read many times over. But I think I've been rambling long enough at this point. Obviously, when it comes to superhero movies and comics and that sort of thing, I could talk about it ad nauseum, but at a certain point, you have to just stop recording, edit the video, and get it out there, and save whatever else you want to say for another day. So I'm going to save whatever else might be on my brain for another day, but thank you so much for sticking with me. Hope y'all enjoyed the flick. I'm not going to say I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, because I liked the movie. I didn't love the movie. Like, there's nothing wrong with saying a movie is just pretty good, and I think that's where we stand with Deadpool and Wolverine. It's pretty good. It's So if you like Deadpool and Wolverine, the characters, definitely give it a go. But I'm not going to say this is the next Infinity War or Civil War or Guardians of the Galaxy. It's not on that level at all, and don't believe people saying that's the best superhero movie ever made. They're just... Anyway, they got their own agenda, their own axe to grind. But hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider hitting the or turning the bell notification on, hitting like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Hope everybody has an amazing weekend at the movies. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.